When I moved into Willow Creek Estates, I had three goals: mow my lawn, mind my business, and finally finish a cup of coffee without hearing someone scream about trash bins or mailboxes. I had no idea that within 48 hours, I'd be publicly accused of harboring raccoons, slapped with a $200 fine for a non-existent fence color violation, and be standing face-to-face with a woman who would regret ever underestimating me. She thought I was just another clueless homeowner, but I'm a real estate lawyer, and Brenda had just made the most expensive mistake of her life. It all began on a crisp Saturday morning. I had just finished moving the last box into my new place, stretched my back like a man twice my age, and rewarded myself with a hot mug of French roast. This house was my escape after years in cutthroat litigation, multi-million-dollar property disputes, and the kind of courtroom drama that gave even seasoned judges migraines. I was done. I wanted peace. Birds chirping, grass underfoot, no suits, no contracts, just quiet suburbia. And for 5 minutes, I had it. Then she arrived. She didn't knock. She hovered, a shadow at the edge of my porch, clipboard in hand, three tiny dogs yapping like they had stock in a siren company. She wore oversized sunglasses, a pastel pink tracksuit that could signal aircraft, and an expression like she smelled burnt toast, but knew exactly who burned it and planned to file a complaint. She introduced herself with a tone that balanced perfectly between fake cheer and deep-rooted control issues. "Hi there, I'm Brenda. I'm the acting president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. We just want to make sure new residents settle in properly, you know." It wasn't a question. I smiled, sipped my coffee, and pretended I hadn't just met the human embodiment of an unsolicited pop-up ad. She launched into a monologue about neighborhood expectations, lawn uniformity, holiday decor guidelines, trash can etiquette, fence alignment regulations. I think there was even something about birdhouse proportionality. I nodded like a polite civilian, but internally, I filed away every word. And when she handed me a printout labeled non-compliant observations, I genuinely thought it was a prank. Apparently, my welcome mat was too visually aggressive. It had a pineapple on it. By Monday, I received my first official violation notice. It was folded in half and shoved into my mailbox with the urgency of a ransom letter. The listed offense: failure to align mailbox to HOA specifications. I looked at my mailbox. It was straight. It was black. It was, in fact, exactly like everyone else's. But hers? Hers had gold trim, custom etching, and a small solar-powered light. Interesting. Rather than complain, I responded in the most suburban way possible. I baked banana bread and dropped it off at her doorstep with a note that read, "Thanks for the warm welcome." The next day, I got fined again. This time, for illegal composting. I didn't have a compost bin. I didn't even have time to think about compost. What I did have, though, was a law degree and a photographic memory. By Wednesday, Brenda had escalated. She parked outside my house to inspect my hedges. I waved. She didn't wave back. I received a third notice. My porch light was too bright. I started to wonder if she had binoculars. The kicker came that evening during a walk around the neighborhood. I saw her at a cul-de-sac meeting, holding court with a group of nervous-looking residents who nodded at everything she said. When she spotted me, she smiled and waved like we were old friends. The crowd turned, expecting me to return the gesture. I waved back, but not because I was being friendly. I was calculating, taking mental notes. You see, Brenda wasn't just enforcing rules. She was creating them on a whim. No oversight, no vote, and judging by the quiet desperation in the eyes of those around her, no one dared question it. That's when I realized this HOA wasn't just overbearing, it was corrupt. And Brenda? She wasn't a harmless busybody. She was running a one-woman regime. So, I got to work. That night, I pulled out my laptop, poured myself a second coffee, and began reading the HOA bylaws. There were dozens of pages, most of them boilerplate, but hidden between the lines were glaring inconsistencies. No recent election records, amendments with no signatures, financial reports that didn't add up. It wasn't just shady, it was illegal. Brenda had overstepped so far she was standing in quicksand, and she didn't even know it. I smiled to myself. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. This was personal, but I played it cool. The next morning, I joined Brenda on my front lawn as she pointed out a single dandelion poking through the grass. "You'll want to take care of that," she said with the seriousness of a bomb technician. "Oh, absolutely," I replied. "Wouldn't want to violate any community standards." She smirked. I smiled wider. And while she strutted away, leash in one hand and clipboard in the other, I knew something she didn't. She thought she'd found her next target, but she'd actually picked her final opponent. By the end of my first week in Willow Creek Estates, I had a neat folder labeled Brenda, filled with every violation letter, every inconsistency in the HOA bylaws, and every bizarre quote she'd muttered within earshot. Most people would have moved or hired a landscaper to keep the peace. I, however, had different instincts. Brenda had no idea that the man she was peppering with fines once cross-examined a billionaire into tears over a zoning loophole. This wasn't going to end with a simple cease and desist. No, this was going to be a takedown. It started innocently enough, or at least as innocently as HOA manipulation could go. One afternoon, while casually jogging around the neighborhood, I noticed that Brenda's house had a strange, newly installed fountain in the front yard. Now, our HOA guidelines were clear: no water features without prior approval. And yet, there it was, spitting recycled water over a sculpture shaped suspiciously like her 3 yapping dogs. Just for fun, I asked a few neighbors if they remembered voting on the fountain installation. The answer was unanimous: Brenda just did it. Curious, I started looking deeper into the HOA records. Normally, this kind of documentation would be stored and made accessible to all members: meeting minutes, financial reports, voting records. They're legally required in any functioning homeowners association. What I found was a mess of half-filled documents, skipped elections, and what looked like Brenda's personal grocery list paperclipped to the HOA's landscaping budget. According to the records, Brenda had been the acting president for 7 years. The HOA bylaws capped leadership terms at 2. I had my proof. But the funny thing about taking someone like Brenda down is that you can't go in guns blazing. She didn't fear lawsuits or legal terms, mostly because she didn't understand them. She feared being embarrassed, being exposed, and most of all, losing control. So, I let her believe she still had it. I let her feel powerful right up until the moment she signed her own defeat. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. A few days later, a notice arrived on my door with big red letters that read, "Emergency HOA meeting. Mandatory attendance." The location? Brenda's living room. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly out of curiosity and partly to test her reaction. She looked surprised, maybe even flustered. There were cheese cubes on a paper plate, a punch bowl filled with something orange and undrinkable, and 6 other homeowners scattered around the living room like middle schoolers at a dance. Brenda launched into the meeting with the grace of a dictator on caffeine. She began reading from a document titled Revised Neighborhood Compliance Agreement, which included things like a mandatory color harmony review for exterior paint jobs and a ban on lawn ornaments taller than 6 inches. I raised my hand. She ignored me. I raised it higher. She finally gave a tight smile. "Yes, James. I just had a quick question about the HOA election cycle," I said. "These revisions, who voted on them?" Brenda froze for half a second before snapping back. "We discussed these in last quarter's meeting. It was unanimous." Interesting. I pulled quietly and legally from the records, because according to the record, there hadn't been a last quarter meeting, nor a vote, nor a single documented decision on any of these so-called rules. I smiled and nodded. "Great," I said. "I'll be sure to review the minutes." Brenda blinked. "What minutes exactly?" The meeting ended awkwardly, with 2 homeowners slipping out before the cheese cubes could be weaponized. As I stood to leave, Brenda approached me. "You seem very interested in our processes," she said, her tone like a librarian catching a kid trying to steal a book. "I just like to be thorough," I replied. "After all, we both care about the community, don't we?" Her eyes narrowed just slightly, and then she smiled, the kind of smile that meant war. The next morning, my car was gone. Not stolen, towed. Apparently, I had parked it 1 inch over the painted line in the shared cul-de-sac. Brenda had it hauled at 6:43 a.m., right as I was pouring my coffee. The tow truck driver was apologetic. "She does this," he said under his breath. "Got 4 cars last month." That was her first counterpunch. She thought I'd retaliate by yelling or writing angry emails. Instead, I picked up the phone and called a former colleague who now worked for a private investigation firm. Within 2 days, I had a full workup on Brenda Donnelly, past addresses, known associates, and most interestingly, property records. Turns out, Brenda had quietly been purchasing foreclosed homes within the Willow Creek neighborhood using her brother-in-law's name. Then, using her HOA authority, she would find the existing owners into default, buy the properties cheap, and flip them. It was subtle, It was smart. It was also so very, very illegal. At this point, I could have gone straight to the authorities, but that would have ended the story too quickly, and Brenda deserved a proper unraveling. I waited. 2 more fake code enforcement notices arrived on my door that week. One accused me of unauthorized shrub trimming. The second claimed my recycling bin contained non-recyclable emotional support materials, which made me laugh for a full minute. She was getting desperate, sloppy. She wasn't used to a target smiling back. I returned the favor by requesting a full audit of the HOA financials, citing my rights as a dues-paying member. I submitted the letter via certified mail, emailed it twice, and left a hard copy taped to her custom gold trim mailbox. No response, but word was spreading. Neighbors started coming to me with their own stories. Fines that appeared out of nowhere, board meetings canceled minutes before they began, Brenda rewriting rules mid-month to accommodate her whims. Some were afraid, some were furious. All of them wanted change. So, I gave them a plan. We wouldn't storm the gates. We'd follow the rules, every single one. We'd hold a proper vote. We'd document everything. We'd file complaints through the proper legal channels. We wouldn't stoop to Brenda's level. We'd rise above it. And when the smoke cleared, she'd be the one stuck explaining herself to a judge. Because the best way to beat a tyrant isn't with a sword. It's with a clipboard and a subpoena. By the time the weekend rolled around, I had become somewhat of a myth in Willow Creek Estates. Whispers floated between driveways and over hedges. Neighbors I had never spoken to began greeting me with cautious optimism, the kind usually reserved for someone who just adopted a pit bull and promised it was very friendly. I was no longer just the new guy with the offensive welcome mat. I was becoming the one person who might actually stand up to Brenda, and she knew it. So she struck again, this time with flair. Monday morning, I walked outside to find a handwritten sign taped to my front door in thick red marker. Property under review for repeated violations. Surveillance in progress. It was unsigned, of course, but we both knew where it came from. I looked up. A brand new security camera had been mounted on a nearby utility pole, facing directly at my home. Brenda had officially moved into the petty dictator phase of her campaign. Naturally, I took a picture of the camera, cross-referenced city utility ordinances, and confirmed it had been installed without permission. I also spotted the work order, her nephew's construction company. Sloppy again. I logged it, then smiled for the camera and waved before heading to work. That night, I submitted a formal complaint to the city and copied Brenda on the email, complete with time-stamped photos. No response. Not even a fake legal letter this time. She was reeling, but retaliation was inevitable. And sure enough, 2 nights later, my trash cans were mysteriously tagged with orange stickers that read, "Improper waste sorting. Pending fine." According to Brenda's new HOA bulletin, which conveniently arrived that same evening, I was guilty of non-compliant refuse behavior. I opened my bin and found a banana peel in the plastics container. I don't eat bananas. Someone planted it. The next day, I finally decided to let a little of my professional mask slip. At the block's midweek community potluck held near the community pool, I arrived late with a cooler of sparkling water and a smile. Brenda was already holding court near the dessert table, barking instructions at 2 teenage volunteers and passive-aggressively rearranging the fruit trays. When I approached, her expression tightened, but she recovered quickly. "Well, if it isn't our most enthusiastic homeowner," she said. "Brenda," I replied with a polite nod. "I brought drinks. No bananas, I promise." A few people chuckled. Brenda's lips twitched, but she didn't bite. We stood there, locked in a polite standoff, while around us neighbors dipped tortilla chips and quietly eavesdropped. That's when a man I recognized from 3 houses down stepped forward and shook my hand. "Hey, you're James, right? Heard you helped the Thompsons with that boundary issue last week." "Happy to," I said. "Real estate law is kind of my thing." There was a beat of silence, and I could feel Brenda's posture shift. She turned slightly, her voice much sharper now. "Oh, are you an attorney?" "Real estate mostly," I said. "Zoning disputes, property fraud, HOA overreach, you know, the usual." You could have heard a pin drop on a marshmallow. Brenda's smile became a thin line. She turned and fussed with the punch bowl, but the mood had changed. People were curious now, curious and emboldened. For the rest of the potluck, I spoke with neighbor after neighbor, hearing stories that ranged from outrageous to tragic. One woman had been fined for having too many potted plants on her porch. A retired veteran had received a notice for displaying a flag that was not HOA approved. Another resident had been denied a fence permit 6 times, while Brenda's cousin got one approved in 2 days. Patterns emerged, and none of them favored Brenda. That weekend, I hosted a quiet gathering in my backyard. Just a few neighbors, some lemonade, and a stack of printed HOA documents with sticky notes peeking out like feathers on a peacock. What began as small talk turned into a full-blown strategy session. I explained the legal rights homeowners actually had, the bylaws Brenda had violated, and how we could challenge her authority through the HOA's own procedures if we did it by the book. People listened, people nodded, and people volunteered. We formed a committee, unofficial but determined. I called it the Reform Circle because we didn't want a coup, we wanted order. And if there was one thing Brenda had never expected, it was order working against her. By Monday, I had helped 3 different homeowners file official requests for financial disclosure from the HOA board. Brenda responded by pretending the requests were never received. Unfortunately for her, we sent them certified mail and copied a local housing authority. The clock had started ticking, but Brenda wasn't done. One afternoon, as I was mowing my lawn, a code enforcement officer showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand, looking both apologetic and confused. "Someone reported you for operating a business out of your home," he said. I blinked. "A business? They said you've been conducting legal services from here without a permit." I laughed. "I've been drinking lemonade and explaining bylaws. Is that illegal now?" He sighed and gave me a look that said he'd seen too much HOA drama for one lifetime. After a brief inspection, he confirmed everything was in order. I offered him lemonade. He declined. It was getting ridiculous now. Brenda was grasping at straws, trying every trick she could to scare me into backing down. What she didn't realize was that every overreach she committed, every desperate move she made, only gave me more ammunition. Every false report, every manipulated rule, every misstep, it was all being documented, carefully, legally, precisely. And it was almost time to strike. The Reform Circle had grown. We now had 10 active members, each with specific tasks. One researched city code, another monitored HOA expenditures. One particularly sharp high school student designed a website to organize the documents we'd gathered. We called it Brenda Watch, password protected, of course. It was a glorious, slow-burning revolution. But what sealed Brenda's fate wasn't a document or a meeting, it was a receipt. Buried inside a poorly scanned HOA expense report was a charge for $12,450 labeled landscaping consultation. Digging deeper, we found that the check had been issued to a company registered to Brenda's brother-in-law, a company that, according to county records, had 0 active landscaping projects and no employees other than him. We had her. I didn't celebrate. I prepared. Because the time for polite resistance was over. The time for legal reckoning had arrived. The letter arrived on a sunny Thursday afternoon, hand-delivered by a man in a pressed suit who didn't bother to hide his amusement. Brenda opened the door, expecting a package. What she got instead was a subpoena. Her smile faltered the moment she read the bold header at the top. A formal audit had been initiated. Her position as HOA president was being challenged under civil fraud statutes. She glanced up at the man on her porch like he had just handed her a live snake. He simply tipped his head and walked away. That same evening, she sent out a community-wide email titled, "Urgent Clarification Regarding Recent Misinformation," which read more like a high school breakup letter than an official notice. She blamed rumors, a few disgruntled residents, and, of course, me, a new neighbor who seems to misunderstand how HOAs work. She signed off with a passive-aggressive quote about integrity, clearly found from a Pinterest board titled Leadership Vibes. What she didn't know was that the audit had already uncovered missing funds, fake invoices, and enough discrepancies to put her in serious legal jeopardy. By the end of the week, things had started to move quickly. The Reform Circle met every evening, poring over documentation like detectives in a TV drama. We found duplicate charges for the same landscaping services, extravagant reimbursements for board retreats that had never happened, and thousands of dollars in unexplained miscellaneous expenses. Every line item we traced led back to Brenda or someone closely tied to her. And the more we uncovered, the more her grip on the neighborhood loosened. For years, she'd kept people too afraid to question her. Now, they were volunteering to testify. Brenda, of course, didn't go down quietly. She called a special HOA meeting and made a grand production out of it. It was held in the community clubhouse, which she'd adorned with cheap balloons and a table of cookies shaped like tiny gavels. There were rows of chairs, most empty, though she had coerced a few loyal residents into sitting up front like a live studio audience. She walked to the front like a talk show host and began her speech with a syrupy tone that tried and failed to mask panic. She rambled about tradition, about protecting the spirit of the neighborhood, about how some people just don't understand the complexities of leadership. She talked about being attacked, misunderstood, undermined. She didn't mention the subpoena. She didn't mention the missing money. But she did make the fatal mistake of inviting questions. I raised my hand. Her eyes twitched, but she nodded. "Just one quick question, Brenda," I said. "How does a $12,450 landscaping consultation go to a company with no landscaping equipment, no employees, and a single manager listed? Your brother-in-law?" There was a long silence, a few gasps. One person actually dropped their cookie. She stammered something about outside contractors and approved vendors, but I didn't need to press her. The crowd had already started murmuring. The illusion had cracked. The following week, Brenda was forced to sit for a deposition as part of the formal legal process. We held it in a rented office downtown. She arrived in a blazer a size too large, with oversized sunglasses and a manila folder clutched like a security blanket. Her lawyer, clearly hired last minute, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The court reporter sat ready, fingers poised. What followed was one of the most uncomfortable 2 hours of her life. She evaded. She exaggerated. She tried to sound confident, but kept tripping over her own statements. I watched quietly from a corner, not as her interrogator, but as the man who had made it all happen. Every question came from a lawyer I trusted. Every answer Brenda gave tied her in a tighter knot. When asked to explain the financial process of approving invoices, she answered, "We usually just go with our instincts." When asked to define her role, she replied, "I oversee things that need to be seen." It was both ridiculous and damning. 2 days later, a forensic accountant we'd hired completed the final report. In it were details about account transfers, irregular reimbursements, and even a personal vacation to Scottsdale funded by security upgrades. The total in misappropriated funds was nearly $60,000, enough to trigger not just civil penalties, but potential criminal investigation. The report was submitted to both the city and the county. Brenda's world, carefully built over years of unchecked power, was now collapsing from every side. But the final stroke, the one that truly ended her reign, came not from me or any adult in the community, but from a teenager named Olivia. Olivia was a high school senior, a self-taught coder who had joined our reform circle early on to help design our digital archive. She had gone a step further and created an interactive database of every HOA action Brenda had ever filed, complete with dates, fines, property photos, and contradictory rules. She even made it searchable. It went viral in our community overnight. Neighbors spent hours combing through it, laughing at absurd citations like overly cheerful garden gnome or excessive flag flapping. But they also found things that made them furious. Patterns of targeted harassment, clear favoritism, selective enforcement. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was abuse of power on a neighborhood scale. And now it was public. Brenda tried to threaten legal action against the website. Her demand letter was full of misspelled legal jargon, including the phrase cyber slander, which isn't a thing. We sent her a formal rebuttal within the hour. She went silent. The city issued an official notice that the HOA was to cease all activity pending an external review. Brenda was suspended from her role, effective immediately. Her name was scrubbed from the HOA website. Her mailbox, the gold-trimmed monstrosity she was so proud of, was found knocked over the next morning. Nobody saw anything. We didn't throw a party. We didn't spike the football. This wasn't about gloating. It was about fixing what had been broken for too long. I spent the next few days meeting with neighbors, working with legal counsel to draft a new, transparent structure for the HOA, one built on actual community values, not fear. People volunteered. People smiled more. The neighborhood began to feel like a neighborhood again. As for Brenda, she barricaded herself inside her house for a while. The dogs still barked, the curtains stayed drawn, and slowly, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. Handwritten below it, someone had taped a note. It read simply, "Buyer beware." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, tucked inside a beige county building with flickering fluorescent lights and the faint smell of old carpet. But what it lacked in grandeur, it more than made up for in satisfaction. Brenda sat 3 rows ahead of me, stiff and tight-lipped in a navy blue suit that looked borrowed and uncomfortable. Her lawyer looked exhausted, flipping through a binder that no doubt held more excuses than actual defenses. Around us, a few neighbors had come to watch, silently taking their seats with the eager tension of people who had waited too long for justice. When the judge entered, the room snapped into quiet. The proceedings were straightforward. The case against Brenda wasn't built on drama. It was built on facts, numbers, documents, receipts, layer upon layer of carefully gathered truth. I didn't need to testify. Everything had already been submitted. The financial audit, the forged meeting minutes, the fraudulent invoices, even Olivia's online archive had been printed and presented in chronological order. There was nothing left to argue. Brenda's lawyer tried to frame her as a well-meaning volunteer overwhelmed by responsibility, but the judge didn't buy it. Not after seeing the Scottsdale spa receipts labeled as security enhancements and the landscaping payments to a company that didn't own so much as a shovel. When the judge finally ruled, his tone was calm, but his words hit like a gavel strike. Brenda was to pay restitution to the HOA in full. She was removed from her position permanently and barred from holding any leadership role in any homeowners association for 10 years. The court would oversee the HOA's finances for the next 18 months. And the best part? Any homeowner who had been unjustly fined could file for reimbursement from the restitution fund. The gasp that followed was barely contained. Brenda didn't move. She stared straight ahead, blinking like someone who just had their house leveled by a slow-moving wrecking ball. Her reign was over, not with fireworks or handcuffs, but with the quiet, inescapable weight of consequences finally catching up. After the verdict, I stepped outside to a round of handshakes and quiet thank yous. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was relief, the kind of deep, satisfying breath you take after holding it for too long. People smiled differently now. The same neighbors who once looked over their shoulders when speaking out now talked openly, freely. They laughed more. Some even joked about starting a podcast called Brenda Chronicles, though we all agreed we didn't want to give her any more attention than she'd already consumed. With the court's ruling behind us, the next step was rebuilding. Not just the HOA structure, but the sense of trust that Brenda had corroded over the years. We held a proper election. We followed the rules. Every meeting was public, with minutes posted online. We created subcommittees, not to micromanage paint colors, but to discuss real improvements, better street lighting, playground renovations, a new dog park, actual community building. I was elected HOA president by a margin so wide I had to double-check the numbers, but I only accepted on one condition. I wouldn't serve more than one term. This wasn't a throne. It was a service, and it needed to remain that way. Brenda, meanwhile, had become a ghost. Her house sat quiet and shuttered. The for sale sign stayed up for weeks with no bites. Word had spread, and the internet had a long memory. Eventually, she was forced to lower the price. Rumor had it she was moving out of state, somewhere quiet where people didn't know her name. Good luck with that. Then, one late afternoon, as I was reviewing garden proposals on my porch, a black SUV pulled into Brenda's driveway. A well-dressed couple stepped out and walked to the front door, where a real estate agent was waiting with a folder in hand. I watched from a distance, sipping iced tea, not particularly interested until I saw the papers they were holding. Legal documents, final sale paperwork. And then the agent turned, gestured toward the street, and made eye contact with me. That's when it clicked. I was the closing attorney on Brenda's sale. She didn't know yet. My firm handled closings through a rotating system, and hers had landed squarely on my desk. I had reviewed the papers a few days earlier without looking at the seller's name, focused only on property details and contract terms. But now it all aligned. It felt almost too perfect, poetic. The next morning, I arrived at the title office ahead of schedule. I wore a simple suit, the same one I used for closings that didn't require drama. I placed the folder on the table, adjusted my pen, and waited. Brenda walked in 10 minutes late, clearly flustered and trying hard not to show it. Her real estate agent gave a tense smile. Brenda froze when she saw me. "You?" she said, her voice thin. "Good morning, Brenda," I replied. "I'll be handling your closing today." She didn't sit down at first, just stood there looking like she might melt into the floor. Then, slowly, she lowered herself into the chair, never quite making eye contact. The closing itself was uneventful. I kept it professional, walking her through the forms, pointing out where to initial, explaining the terms. But right before the final signature, I paused. There's a clause here regarding disclosure, I said. Just confirming you've notified the buyers of all HOA-related history, investigations, and recent litigation connected to the property? Her jaw clenched. I assume you've included the court ruling? Silence. It's standard, I continued casually. Not disclosing legal disputes can result in serious consequences. You wouldn't want another complaint filed? I'm sure. She signed. When it was done, I handed her a receipt, stood up, and extended my hand. She hesitated, then shook it. Have a good day, Brenda, I said. As she walked out, shoulders heavy, I watched her disappear through the glass doors. It was done. Back in Willow Creek Estates, life had found a new rhythm. Lawns still got a little too long. Someone's kids still played the drums at odd hours, and raccoons occasionally knocked over trash bins. But now, when problems arose, we handled them like neighbors. Together, fairly, with actual conversation instead of citations. We were no longer a community under siege. We were just a community. Sometimes, as I sip coffee on my porch and look at the quiet street Brenda once ruled like a queen without a crown, I think about how close we came to losing it all to one person's control, and how powerful the truth becomes when you pair it with action. She thought I was just another homeowner. She thought I'd roll over, accept the fines, repaint my mailbox, and apologize for my porch light. But I didn't. I stood up, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been silenced, intimidated, and walked over. Because that's the thing about people like Brenda. They think they're untouchable until the law touches back.